Hello, everyone. Welcome to our RSCE committee meeting. I would like to call to order the Rail Service and Community Enhancements RSCE committee meeting of the North County Transit District for today, February 7th, 2023. Before we begin, I would like to inform members of the public who may be viewing the meeting on the district's YouTube page that in order to make a public comment during the meeting, you must connect to the meeting using the Zoom link provided on the agenda. You must also register with the clerk by sending an email to clerk@nctd.org with a name and or phone number and which item you would like to speak on. I will ask Suhil Rodriguez, clerk of the board, to call the roll.
Committee Chair Contreras,
Present.
Committee Vice Chair Hensey. Here. Board Member Jenkins.
Here.
Board Member Patel.
Here.
That completes the roll.
Thank you so much. And Suhil, if she'll now provide a safety brief and review evacuation procedures.
Thank you. In case of an emergency, I will dial 911. In case of an evacuation, please take the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once cleared of the building, do not re-enter unless cleared to do so by emergency personnel. There are fire extinguishers and first aid kits on each floor of the building. There is a portable defibrillator on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures if needed. This concludes my safety brief.
Thank you for that. You never know when it comes in handy until it's coming in handy at that time. So we have to go over it every single time. And Suhil, it looks like we do have some public comments today. And I guess now is the time to take this. Speakers are going to be limited to 3 minutes, and I'll go ahead and call your name. It looks like I have Lori Robin. Thank you, Lori.
Ms. Robin, you have 3 minutes.
Hi. September 2019, a bicycle rider, Carlsbad Village Road. June 2020, a pedestrian, Carlsbad Station. November 2021, a person in a wheelchair, Carlsbad Station. February 2022, one person dead, 2700 block, State Street. My name is Lori Robbins, and I live in Carlsbad, and I would like my town to be safe for pedestrians. Carlsbad population, tourism, and foot traffic has grown tremendously in the past 10 years. With this growth, the danger has increased on the tracks. The current surface crossing does not provide an adequate warning for pedestrians, especially those with limited mobility, sight, or hearing. The gates in Carlsbad are designed for cars and not pedestrians. An extended arm continues on alternate sides of the sidewalk, providing no gate at 2 entries. When the train is stopped at Carlsbad Station, I often observe people running across the tracks. This situation stresses out your engineers, who have to aggressively use their horn to prevent accidents. Downtown San Diego has safe gates and quiet zones spanning 13 crossings. Oceanside has installed pedestrian gates and quiet zones that work well and protect lives. Carlsbad should be protecting lives like San Diego and Oceanside. I understand that installing a gate costs approximately $1 million and can be accomplished relatively quickly. Trenching the train tracks is more than 100 times as expensive, and there is no schedule. The dangers on the track are sure to increase as the future plans include proposals to install double track and housing. We cannot afford to wait. We don't want to declare a train emergency in addition to our current bicycle emergency. Let's put an end to these future fatalities of our citizens, our young adults, our disabled, and our elderly. Let's get this done now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Our next public speaker is Jacques Demerco.
For a long time, and
Mr. Burke, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to address, this is off the agenda, but I think it speaks directly to all of you, and I've been mulling over this, and I wanted to state it, formally to you. So my idea is that we need to make the bus free. And I know that you're probably thinking, Jacques, that's crazy. Why would we do that? And so I'm going to explain to you why it would be good for our community and how we can make it happen. So what we need in this day and age is to build our communities. I think in light of our recent pandemic, is that a lot of things have come up into flux, and it's a good moment to like reevaluate what's going on. And so one of the biggest problems is our transportation. We just expanded the freeway, and it's obviously not going to be enough to move people around. So we need people to change their mindset. And so how could we possibly do that? So one way I think could really solve the problem is making the bus free, because it would destigmatize taking the bus in the first place. Right now, I'm one of the few people that takes the bus who can afford to drive a car. Usually it's split. And so what I find is that most people who take the bus have some kind of problem that they don't like. Usually it's economic, that they don't take a car. But so many people have that opportunity to take the bus every day. And if it was free, it would change the mindset completely. Like, why am I not taking the bus? Why shouldn't I take the bus? And there's so many good reasons to take the bus. So one of the things we can do is buy electric buses, and it would reduce our, climate footprint for not just the city, but North County. We can give all the tourists bus passes, and it would change the way our North County interacts with tourism. To give me just a few more seconds. We can give that boon. Right now, if you have to buy a bus pass, it's a lot of strain for those people who can't afford it. And so that money would go directly to them. They wouldn't have to buy a bus pass anymore, and they could ride the bus for free.
30 seconds.
All those buses that people could take the bus downtown and go to bars and restaurants and never have to worry about getting a DUI. We could change that mindset completely. And I know you're thinking how can we possibly afford that? Our ridership is so high, and that costs a lot of money. But right now I just checked, and there's several DOT grants that we could write and address and make up. They're worth up to $25 million. And so I think we could do that. I think we could go through the
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Jacques.
so much.
Your time is up, but I would since this is not agendized, I just want to say I'm a huge proponent. Obviously I'm here, but I'm a huge proponent for public transit. I usually take the bus here and actually miss my bus. And because we don't have enough frequency on the 303, I had an Uber here and spend $20 when I could have just spent a little bit more time and done it for less on the bus. But I will say that I know there's some stuff that happened in the 1970s that make it difficult. It's TDA, fare box recovery. And so there's stuff at the at our state level that needs to change in order for us to be able for it to make sense. I know it doesn't even make sense, right, to say that we can't have free public transit, but there's some real constraints. And what I would like is, I don't think it probably won't be appropriate for a RSCE committee, but maybe for MSBDA, for us to actually go through TDA and fare box recovery and what that looks like, and what some of the legislative pushes can be, the advocacy to maybe bring that to fruition, especially as we're looking at youth opportunity pass and whatnot, to be able to not only maintain 18 and under, but to grow it to 24 and possibly to add different populations to it until we can get something that's more beneficial for everybody. But I for one would love to have free transportation for everybody. So thank you. I appreciate your comments.
Yeah, thanks.
And hopefully you'll stay in contact.
Yeah, I would love to be, if anybody's serious about it, I would love to work with them on writing the grant and figuring it out.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will make sure to give you my card.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you. This is just to Ms. Robin. I know, I just wanted to mention, I know it's not agendized today, what you brought up, but I am discussing internally with our staff and we'll circle back with you on that. Of course. Thanks.
All right. And don't leave quite yet because at some point I have to chair the meeting, but so I can't go and give you my contact information, but you can find me on social media. If you're there, you can just DM me too. It's at Represent Vista. Pretty easy to find. Yeah. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Not too active on Snapchat, but I have one. So, all righty. Well, I really appreciate the comments. We don't usually have public comments, so thank you so much. And we are doing everything that we can to address some of these issues. And I look forward to having more strategies to address pedestrians and free transit in the future, and cyclists safety. With that said, Sukhil, do we have any remaining public comments?
No, ma'am.
All right. Well, at this time, we are ending the public registration for general public comment. And before we get into specific items on the agenda for this meeting, I would like to outline meeting protocols to make this meeting as efficient as possible. First, please hold your comments and or questions until after the agenda item has been presented. Second, let me flip this over. When the time comes for board member comments or questions, please raise your hand and I will call on you in the order received. So our first item on the agenda will be a presentation on the benefits and risks of at-grade versus grade separated crossings, the regulatory framework to approve new railroad crossings, and the safety considerations recommended by state and federal agencies. Devin Rouse, Strategic Rail Advisor, will be presenting this item. You have our attention. Thank you.
Good morning, Committee Chair Contreras. I just wanted to add before we get started that here with us today and on the line from the California Public Utilities Commission, Rail Crossings and Engineering Branch of the Rail Safety Division is Matthew Bond, Program and Project Supervisor, and Howard Huey, Utilities Engineer, and they will be available to answer any questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Thank you.
Well, good morning. It's afternoon for me coming from the East Coast, so I have to remember to say the right thing. And it's good to see you again. A lot to cover in this presentation. We could spend an entire day on it, but we're going to try to boil it down to the most salient points for everyone here and get some hopefully useful information out to you and have some time for comments and questions if you'd like. Next slide. Thanks. I think the last time I was here, we talked more about the regulatory process and how it affects rail. We're not going to do that again, but just we'll start off with a reminder in that regard, then jump right into what I think we're more interested to talk about, and that's crossing projects themselves, and in particular at grade versus grade separated. But just some general notes on any crossing project or project near a railroad right away that just may be useful and helpful information to consider for any project that you're doing in the future. We'll talk a little bit more about the regulatory process specific to crossings and some expectations there, along with the timelines and efficiencies. And I think we've kind of combined those two last bullets into one slide for the sake of time. But I think there's some good information there as well that we can hopefully answer some questions on.
Can
Okay.
I ask one question? I'm sorry.
Sure.
I wasn't at a previous meeting here. Are you Matthew or Howard?
I am Devin Rouse.
You're
Sorry.
Devin.
Yes.
Okay. And Matthew and Howard are available.
They're on the phone. Yes.
Got it.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yes. Sorry about that. You're right. New face. Okay. Next slide. I don't like spending too much time talking about me because I'm not that helpful, but getting to the info itself. Again, and for your sake, the last time we met, we talked a lot about the regulatory process and who's involved. And so we can get that information to you if you'd like to have that. I think that might be helpful. It's a lot on the rail side, right? And rail's been around for over 200 years. In North America, it's about 196, so a little bit younger. If we consider how long it's been around, but it's one of the oldest regulated industries. And because of that, you've got a lot of things to sort through with anything when we talk about railway projects. At a minimum, as you may recall, you're going to have to deal with multiple entities when you talk about certain projects. With crossings in particular, you've got CPUC. You're probably going to have FRA involved. And if you're dealing with highway traffic, then you can bet on Caltrans and potentially FHWA being involved at a minimum, along with some other entities as well, potentially. Next slide. So bottom line, as we've talked about before, part of the reason for being here is to help you. And anything that you're looking at doing, we can help you navigate that space early and often. Talking with those entities is important. But let's get into the meat of the discussion. That's really at grade versus grade separated. Talk a little bit about the benefits and risks, and I'm boiling it down more the pros and cons, just to be straightforward, and some of the considerations for each approach. But also we'll touch on some general characteristics about crossing projects and things to be aware of. Next slide. So first, before we jump into one or the other, I think it's important to touch on some of the things that are important to consider for any project along the railroad right away. First is obviously stakeholder input in the approval process. Again, hearkening back to that first slide, understanding the timelines, the hierarchy of the different organizations involved and what their role and authority is, and the different authorities having jurisdiction, and any major hold points is critical. If we're talking about something that has approval timeline of 6, 8, 10, even 18 plus months, that's important to kind of bake into the process and understand and set everyone's expectations, particularly if it's in a federal approval, right? That I know, being from the other side, it's when you have a project, it's important, but when you have an entire country worth of projects and different issues going on at the same time, it doesn't always move at the same timeline I think that we would like it to move at. And that's important to kind of craft that into the process in the beginning so that you can help work towards that expectation of how long it will take to get some of these things done and get decisions back from people that need to weigh in on things. The other important consideration is the funding requirements, depending on where you're getting that money, especially if you're getting a grant or a loan or any federal money, especially, but even for state funding opportunities. Project eligibility and reporting is always a big thing. There's always going to be strings attached. If it is federal, you've got potential domestic content requirements. That's not a big issue typically with grade crossing. It's much bigger of an issue if you're buying rolling stock or something of that nature. I put it there though, because if you're looking at some novel technology, especially grade crossing safety technology, then you could get into that space where it's not available here because we don't do a lot of state-of-the-art R&D railway research, right? You may have noticed it's freight, yes, but a lot of the state-of-the-art R&D is coming from Europe and Asia and things of that nature. So if you are looking at something and a project involves something that isn't the normal single signal bungalow or the lights and gates, that could be an issue to consider. Also, it's important to think about any future expansion. You know, the work that you do today, how does that impact future expansion plans and work that might be done tomorrow? And also potential neighboring projects and the impact on them. When it comes to funding, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on latter slides, it's important to remember if you have multiple projects going for the same pot of money, usually, especially if it's in the same geographic area, you're going to get a decision that there's more projects than there's money available. So the reality is, especially on the federal side, is that they're going to look at where you're located in terms of divvying up money, because you don't want to give too much money to the same location, or even the same state in some cases. So it is a potential issue if you think about multiple projects and there's a big funding opportunity. If there's an ability to coordinate and make it a bigger project, usually that's something that you want to take a look at. And I think that's one of the benefits of having these discussions with this committee. If there are the opportunities out there, even if they're not directly adjacent to each other, but we can package it as a bigger program, you're going to have a much better chance of getting dollars and have a much better chance of not undercutting each other for some of those limited dollars. The next issue is thinking about any of these projects, the supplemental safety enhancements that go around with it. And I'd rephrase that to say how effective your project is, right? Anybody can build a crossing, but if nobody uses that crossing, what good have you done? And this is the biggest issue that I've run into in my years of working with railroads. And you get a couple pictures there in terms of what are you doing in the field? You can get any number of drawings, everything looks great, engineering's great, but when it's actually put in the field, you realize, oh, human nature, right? And I think the pictures there, even though they're kind of small, kind of show you, yes, on the bottom left there, you've got New Jersey Transit. It's not the best in the world. That little gate arm isn't the most effective in stopping people if they really want to get past it, but at least you've kind of channeled people to it. What I often see, especially with brand new railroads, is what the bottom right, and that's just a single signal and gate where, okay, that's great. Nice, expensive little signal you put in there, but I'm just going to walk 2 feet around the right and get right by that. So with any of these projects, I cannot overstate how important it is to consider how it's actually going to be installed in the field and human nature, considering human nature. We're going to want to take the paths of least resistance. You know, if we're to rephrase it, my wife would probably say I'm lazy, right? I'm going to go straight instead of going around and go some other route that may be more circuitous or difficult to get to. So whenever you're doing any of these projects, it's important to think about the final product and how people are actually going to use it. Clearance and sightlines is also important. This is especially for this railroad. We have a higher speed, 90 miles an hour. It's one of the higher speeds in the nation. With that comes long sight distances. I've seen some pretty bad accidents where, because of that issue, especially if there was a sound wall that was installed, you've seen something that you don't want to see just because nobody connected the two projects together. Somebody put up the sound wall, left, somebody did the crossing enhancements and had no connection with the two projects, and nobody thought, can the person actually see that train coming? Because it's not as loud as you think, right? Especially if there's a quiet zone there. And that's something we'll talk about more in detail, but sight lines and clearances are important, and they have to be kind of built into it early on in the process. And it may impact projects that are not directly within what you thought was the footprint of the project. And also the impact of construction operations. You know, anytime you have people out there working, you're going to have horns, you're going to have noise, and you're going to have speed restrictions. So you want to try to limit that, obviously, for disruptions for not only your communities, but to the railroads themselves. And that's something that all too often people forget about, right? They think about the final design and they think about what the project's going to look like when it's done, but you have to actually build the project. And considering that and making sure communities are aware of what impact that might have on them is also important. Next slide. All right, pedestrian crossings. I want to touch on this for a minute, just because I know there's a lot of interest in them and they're a bit unique. For one, as it relates to horns, exclusive pedestrian crossings are actually exempt from the FRA horn rule. However, and this is where we have a dramatic pause for a factory, the actual requirement for FRA was just basically kicked down to the state and local level. Another one of these archaic, preemption versus state and local requirements for railroads. And in the state of California, it's actually state law that drives a requirement. So here in California, you have the sounding of a horn or a similar audible device. We'll call it a horn. It's the same thing, basically, that's required for crossings. And interestingly enough, there isn't really a process like the FRA quiet zone approval process for this state law, as far as we can tell, which means it would likely have to be part of a bigger FRA quiet zone. And in discussions with FRA, one thing that they wanted to point out and make sure everybody was aware of was that you can't actually use pedestrian crossings as the beginning or end of a quiet zone for an FRA quiet zone. So that's important. I want to touch on that because that means if you are installing pedestrian crossings or thinking about it and they're between even within an existing quiet zone or not, and you want it to become an existing quiet zone, you're likely going to be looking at the endpoints of the next highway rail grade crossing as well to be part of a larger project to get a quiet zone. So that means considering not only the project you're working on here, but potential improvements within the entire length of that corridor. And that's important. And FRA has actually been taking a bigger look at the corridor as a whole for those types of approvals, because again, it's not just about that one isolated location, it's about how humans use it. And so you can put up 100-foot fence, 100 feet of fence, and if people are just going to go around it anyways, that's going to be part of the analysis. How did you channel people to use what you're putting out there, or what you're installing? So I thought that was an important thing to touch on because I know they're a bit unique, but it's also, when we talk about community enhancement, we're always looking at ways that we can help improve means of getting across that railroad. So it's not a barrier to people. And we'll talk a little bit more. There's ways you can do that, but we have to think about some of these things we just touched on. Next slide. So with that grade crossings in particular, I think obviously there's no surprise. These are lower cost projects to implement and they have faster implementation times. So when you look at putting a crossing across the railroad, typically people gravitate to let's put something at grade for this very reason. And I will say it should be no surprise to anyone from a safety perspective and from the rail industry's perspective and most of the regulators' perspective. Obviously, we're not big fans of at-grade crossings. In fact, we've been trying to remove them for years now and get as many out as we can. Now that said, though, if it's done correctly and you consider some of the things that we talked about earlier, especially about how people would use that crossing and making sure you make the investments to make it effective, it can reduce risk. It can be a good thing if it's done correctly. So I don't want to just dismiss it as don't do it at all, but you have to make the right investments. You have to make the right decisions and make it effective. But that said, there's certainly some downsides to it. You're never going to be able to eliminate the risk completely. There's always going to be the potential that people are going to decide to go across the tracks when they want to go across the tracks. This risk always increases with volume and speed. The more trains you have, the faster they go. As we talked about, sight lines and other issues become more and more important in terms of getting across the tracks safely. They generally, almost every crossing nowadays, whether it's pedestrian or highway, has some form of active crossing device, lights, bells, gates, all that kind of stuff. That is signal equipment. That's regulated equipment. So it's going to require maintenance. It's going to require regular inspections. That's going to be money and funds that are going to have to be thought of, where they come from, who does that work, how it's done, and also track maintenance sometimes as well. You can have an impact in the track structure itself. And when you look at where you have to maintain more, it's usually at crossing locations. They do have increased noise, obviously from horns, but also the gates and bells themselves. You can get quiet zones though. If you get a quiet zone established, that will at least help with the horn. The risk of multiple tracks is always an issue. I think that's something in particular that you have to consider and how that's addressed in terms of not only today, but any future build outs that you're looking at. And certainly they are subject to compliance inspections and periodic safety evaluations. And this is something that I've been on the other side where we had communities, because it's usually not the railroad, it's the community that gets the quiet zone. And we've had communities, I think I've talked about in the past, where they did not maintain the equipment or even install some of the things they were expected to. So we simply took the quiet zone away and he said, we're not sure we're going to issue it again ever. We're going to come back in 10 years maybe. It happens, right? And so it is something that very serious about the maintenance and inspections. It's not just the initial installation. You got to keep it up for the life of the crossing. Next one. Grade separated. Certainly this is a whole different animal altogether. Yes, the positives are that you're going to largely eliminate the collision hazard for crossing movements, but it comes at a caveat. If we're talking pedestrians in particular, it goes back to, did you do it correctly, right? If there's no channelization, most people aren't going to want, and it's just a dark tunnel with poor lighting, most people are going to choose to just walk right across the surface rather than use the nice dark tunnel, right? It's done correctly. And I use Oceanside as an example because it's actually one of the best ones I've actually seen on a railroad. It can actually make a difference, right? If you force people to use it and don't give them the option to simply walk around it, and you make it a pleasant experience, and then it certainly can make a difference in the community. It doesn't require signal systems, so you don't have maintenance, you don't have noise associated with it. There's no quiet zone or no horn required typically outside of construction. It is also available for grant funding typically today. There are a lot of grants and probably a lot more that we've been focusing on to get additional funds and money to eliminate crossings. And so there's a lot more opportunities for grant funding out there when it comes to grade separated. The downsides obviously should be no surprise. They are higher project costs. They do have a generally much larger footprint, especially if you have to consider ADA and other aspects of a design for civil structure. And along with that obviously comes longer implementation timeframes. So should be no surprises there in that aspect. Next slide. Okay. Now, do you want to take this one or do you want me to keep going? Okay. Oh, all right. So to wrap things up, we want to talk a little bit about the process, expectations, and timelines. I'm not going to get back into the history of railroads and regulatory paths, but just to know, if you are building a crossing, it is going to require some level of approval. And at a minimum, that's going to require state approval with CPUC and likely Caltrans if there's a highway involved or road traffic involved. This process could take up to 18 months. So be prepared. If you're looking for FRA and quiet zone approval, if that's required, FRA is going to want to conduct a field investigation before an application is going to be considered. It used to be we would consider applications and then go and do the field investigation at the tail end with the approval of the safety board. And because of various reasons, they've kind of pushed away from that and said, let's do the investigation first to make sure all the improvements were made. Because as I talked about earlier, it's not unusual to go out there and find that some of the improvements that we expected when we signed off on it were never made. So they're going to want to do a field investigation first. And then from there, you could be looking at 6 to 8 months to actually get your application approved. I know I've heard many times that we're going to do it simultaneously with building the crossing. I've never really seen that work out except in the very early days. Usually there's going to be some time period where it's going to be in place with horns until you get the final approval. And again, construction, don't forget about construction. Prepare your communities, let them know that this is going to be happening. It's inconvenient for a time being, but it's required for safety and hopefully the long term, it gets you what you want though. And with that, I think we can go one more slide as well, right? I just kind of threw this in here because I know I've been harping about making sure you make the right investments and that it's effective. And, I'm going to argue that neither of these are actually that effective, but if you compare the two, it's not always how much money you spend. It's about where you put the money and how you think about what the actual site location looks like. The one on the left, you've got multiple signal posts and gates, what looks like some sort of expensive wrought iron fence thing. Nobody's going to go walk through that maze. They're just going to walk 2 feet to the right and go around it, right? It looks great on engineering drawings, right? Ooh, right? Good bill of materials, all that kind of stuff. But come on, humans aren't going to do that. And then on the right, even though it's just a little fence, traditional chain link fence, they at least attempted to bring it all the way up and make it at least more annoying for somebody to try to walk around that signal post. And so again, while it's not the best, I would argue that's more effective than the one on the left there. And so again, when we talk about this, if you're going to do this, think about how it's going to be used by humans and think about the total investment that you're making. It doesn't always mean spending more money. Sometimes it just means spending money wisely and thinking about where you're putting your investments. So I was trying to draw this out so we wouldn't be distracted by Matt and everybody. That's all we have for you. Certainly would love to entertain some questions. I'm sure our CPUC colleagues would love to entertain questions as well, although they may just not be able to respond. I don't know how it works with the audio. So, I was trying to give them an out. So,
Thank you so much. And Sukhil, do we have any public comments for this agenda item?
We do not, Chair.
All right. Well, at this time, we are ending the public registration to speak on this item. With that said, are there any questions from the board? Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, many questions, but I'll try to keep it as short as possible. What I hear you saying is that a lot of these rules regarding at-grade crossings are, they were created by the legislature. So in your opinion, are there specific things that we could ask of our state legislators who represent us to help us ease some of the red tape to get to at-grade crossings? That's what we're hoping to get in Encinitas, because we have some issues in the location where we need the crossings, where we have a gas line. So it's not going to be feasible for us to do an undercrossing like we have in other parts of the community. I understand that in the Del Mar situation too, at grades might be a preferable option. But what can we ask of our state legislators to help us ease some of the burden?
that's a good question. As a federal regulator, I don't know that I'm the best equipped to answer that. So I'll turn it over, see if our state partners have any thoughts on it there, but I don't know, either Matt or Howard.
Sure. Can you hear me?
We can.
All right. So I'm Matthew Bond. I'm Program Project Supervisor with the Rail Crossings and Engineering Branch at CPUC. So the main issue here is, are you, I guess, back up slightly. Is the question about just being able to build at-grade crossings, or the train horn in addition to that?
Well, it's both. So we're hoping to achieve both the quiet crossings and the building of the at-grades. And we're going through significant effort right now at our city to design these at-grade crossings so that they can be either part of a quiet zone or have their own supplemental safety measures to be quiet. So what we're hoping for is more assurance that by the time we're done with the development that we can get that approval. So yeah, that's the question.
All right, so I'll answer it in two parts. In terms of getting authorization to construct the crossings, the CPUC has the exclusive authority over where and in what manner crossings can be built. So that process requires a formal application to the commission. And that's just the process that all crossings go through, whether they're at grade or grade separated. And like it was previously mentioned, that the adjudicatory process takes up to 18 months. That doesn't include the discussions prior to that, which hopefully get concurrence from CPUC staff on what the configuration of a crossing would look like. We have had multiple discussions with the city of Encinitas on what that might look like. And we have stated that as long as we feel that the situation with crossings would be safer than the current situation, which I think there's a good argument to be made that legal crossings, with automatic warning devices, et cetera, would make that corridor safer. That as a general concept, we can get behind that. Does that answer your question as far as the crossings themselves?
I think it did answer my questions. I think we're constantly in a state of wondering if all this effort that we're going through is going to be worthwhile. And you touched on exactly what we're hoping to achieve, which is that the at-grade crossings will be a significant safety enhancement convenience enhancement, quality of life enhancement for the community that surrounds the rail. And coupled with that, you know, we need it to be quiet. So just knowing that you're working with our city staff, I see our city engineer, Jill Bankston here, which makes me very happy. To know that everybody's working together and hearing one another is encouraging. So thank you. Let's see.
Yes, and then just in terms of the of quieting the horns or not having horns, I think there's really two ways to go about that. One would be to create a quiet zone that extends the entire corridor. It looks like that would require not only Lucadia Avenue or Boulevard, excuse me, on one end of the quiet zone, but also extending it all the way to Cannon in Carlsbad. That's the next at-grade crossing. So that would be one possibility. The other would be to change state law to allow the CPUC to, on a case-by-case basis, change the requirements for the train horn. So those are those are the two possibilities.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'll just make this comment that the quiet zone for the corridor, including Carlsbad, is my hope of what we can achieve. And I'm so glad that Councilmember Bat Patel participates in this committee as well, because ultimately it will be up to the city of Carlsbad. And I think that it's important for us to be pursuing a quiet zone for all of our rail corridors, because we are developing homes alongside of most of our rail and our stations. And so for those homes to be desirable and comfortable and for people to actually enjoy living there, it's important that we're not sounding horns all the time. And I'll also say that with the second track eventually coming down the line, that would mean even more horns if we're not quieting them. And so I do feel that it's our responsibility as decision makers now who are going through this exercise of participating in this committee. The end point that would be best case scenario is that we've achieved the quiet zones for all of our communities together. So I think I've got some food for thought. So I'll pass on to my colleagues if they have questions.
I have a couple questions. You spoke briefly on page 4 about hold points. What would be an example of a hold point to us here that would?
So any of these approvals we just talked about,
Okay,
right, where it's out of your hands, you're relying on a third party, be it a regulator or anybody else for that matter, to make a decision and get back to you. Those are typically where they're underestimated usually, right?
Yeah.
Or not even considered at all. And that's where it becomes, you may, as we just talked about, there may be nothing you can do about the time frame. It may take what it's going to take. But being able to set that expectations from everybody from the start is important, because then everybody at least is aware of what it's going to take to get there, especially if it's outside of the state realm. If it goes to the federal level, like I said, it's one of many projects, right? And as much as we want every project to get the full attention, sometimes it's a very long list and very short staff of people that are working through it. So that's where early and often communication is helpful, because we can help kind of guide those expectations. There's also no surprises. To kind of feedback on the previous question, I would say that's the other thing you can do to help reduce the unknowns or potential time frame, is make sure everybody's on the same page, right? Not that it's necessarily a rubber stamp. If everybody is aware of what's going on, has been part of the process, you're going to have much less opportunity for somebody to say, except this needs to be changed. You need to make that investment. Suddenly what took 3 years takes 6 years, right? And I think that's something everybody wants to avoid. So getting involved early to understand those hold points and making sure you have everything you need to get past that hold point with no surprises is important.
okay. And then I'm not sure if this is a question for this item or maybe the next one, but let's just say conceptually NCTD makes the decision to go forward with this project somewhere along the rail line. I'm assuming there's an approval here. From the time it's approved to when it might happen, because all of these agencies working together don't always work together. How many years? I mean, we're talking about many years, correct? How many years would we be looking at, Matt, to have it, to say we're done?
First, I'm committed to not answering.
Okay.
But I think that's why it's critical to kind of know the key milestone
Yes.
activities. I think we can dig up some information to talk about the quiet zone in downtown San Diego. That development and approval, that was a massive project and undertaking. I think it was CCDC when it still existed, was the lead for that. So we can pull you that line item, that schedule. I think the big piece is understanding all of the activities. So there's an element in here, certainly, where you have to reach an agreement with NCTD about the project scope, right? You know, and sometimes people can be confused about the project if it's acceptable to NCTD, and I'll be very candid about a discussion. Del Mar, the ed grade pedestrian crossing project, is a big deal issue for NCTD, for which we have not expressed a level of support from a staff level for an intent to approve, because an ed grade pedestrian crossing, particularly in that area, has a lot of risks that someone will need to assume. Also, there are considerations about if you're asking me then to slow down train traffic or impact my operations, and who's going to own that liability and who's going to insure for it. So I think the key piece, and one of the things that we can do, is plot out some of the key milestone activities, try to engage in some of those activities concurrently. So you're going to at some point have to have an agreement in place with NCTD for the maintenance and the liability of that crossing. So one of the lead things to go ahead and to do is to go ahead and start working on that agreement now, so that that doesn't become a choke point for you later in the project. Those are the kind of things that you can do to advance the projects. And literally the process that we have undergoing here offers the most streamlined approach towards implementing these types of projects that we have ever advanced. Because if you can leverage the benefits and concentrate the costs and get to scale on the implementing these improvements, you can do it more efficiently in that manner rather than one by one projects. We can create templates for agreements that are fairly uniform, that obviously we can tailor them to meet different agreements that we may reach in one location versus another location, because not all locations are equal. So I think you're on the fastest path. I know we'll be able to give you a project schedule in terms of deliverables on that, but the piece is just identifying the key milestone activities and not waiting in a linear fashion. See which ones you can do concurrently so that you can advance the overall timeline for implementing your project, because you can't begin the construction of your project until you have a maintenance and related services agreement with the NCTD.
So I'm not sure that.
I'll get you a schedule.
I'm guessing this is a 5 to 10 year process. Is that minimal?
Well, 10 years seems to me to be excessive.
Yeah, I would.
And I think, and it's really just the unknowns around, to me, a large part of this is the unknowns around the regulatory approval.
Right.
Okay. You know, because look, anytime if you're asking me to do a grade separated project, that's like an easy, we all love grade separated project, because that's the safest outcome that we can have as a project. At grade crossings become more expensive and higher, I guess higher risk endeavors, but you still can make the safety case. And I think, as Matthew from the state was alluding, one of the things that I've always encouraged for cities that are looking at this is to begin kind of with your baseline safety analysis and risk analysis to understand the impacts of certain levels of improvement in terms of changing your baseline case in terms of risk that's out there. And there are additional things that you can do to further limit risk, because that to me is the most compelling thing, that if you can significantly reduce risk compared to the base case, that makes people more willing to say, okay, this is not the perfect project, but it's way better than what exists today.
That's absolutely right. Right. If it's all risk today. And everybody's going to look at risk, not only from the federal perspective, but from a liability perspective, right? And that's the reality of it. And I think Mr. Tucker hit on a very important point, and it's also something that was alluded to earlier with the vice chair's questions. And that's if we can come up with a more programmatic approach, knowing what we want to do for the entire corridor, both of them, right? That's going to set us up much more successfully for future projects. We may not be able to do we're never going to be able to do everything on day one, right? But if you have a plan and you have a process, it makes it easier to get grants, makes everybody involved in the process, whether at the state or the federal level, aware of what the game plan is and how we're going to attack making the corridor, improve the corridor one project at a time or a group of projects at a time. It makes it much better if you have a plan going in rather than what we typically see, and that's ad hoc projects here and there.
Okay. And then you touched on another point. As these hopefully different projects move forward, it's the individual cities who are taking on the liability and much of the costs, which is why the grants are so critical. Okay. Okay, I think that's all I have. Oh, I have one more question. So, is there going to be some sort of rubrics or some sort of point system or something? Because let's say all the cities have projects they want to do. Who's going to evaluate what goes to the top of the list to coordinate as best as possible? So I'm assuming there has to be
I wish that would be the problem. And in fact, I'll give you a little bit of history, and I think it will be good for this committee to know. So years ago, it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 10 years ago, we identified a pot of money for the coastal cities to collaborate to do a programmatic quiet zone study. We could not get the cities to agree to provide the matching funds. And so we reprogrammed those capital dollars and did another endeavor. Obviously, projects, it never gets to a point where projects are already at the same time.
right.
And I tell you the truth, if every city had money and real skin in the game, we'd find a way to accommodate all cities all at the same time. So we're prepared to work through those kinds of activities and hopes, dreams, and aspirations of everybody coming together at the same time. But again, this is about scale. Because if we do have a consensus of Encinitas and Carlsbad ready to do a project, it is so much more cost effective for everyone and time efficient for us to marry those projects up together, even though if one city's money is going to lag a couple of years later, that still allows the vendor and allows us to procure it all at one time with this stage process of when the project is going to be implemented.
And part of the ways where the city comes up with the money is through these grants.
Yeah, I mean, a variety of different sources,
Right,
but
that's probably the number one to most cities.
well, it's very interesting because again, we'll pull the CCDC information about the quiet zone they implemented, about how what was their source of funding for downtown San Diego quiet zones. But right now, there's just this historic opportunity with the bipartisan infrastructure bill for cities to be able to leverage federal and state dollars that are available to do projects. So this is unprecedented. And so that's why we would urge everyone now that if you're going to get serious, you better get serious now. 3 to 5 years now, it may not be the same case about the availability of funds to do these types of projects.
Okay.
And if I would add too, think about what you're asking for. If you're asking for a crossing just by itself, you're going to get some raised eyebrows, right? If you're looking at improvements, safety improvements, especially, and reducing risk to a corridor as a whole, even if you can't do it all on day one, that's much better in terms of trying to get money and trying to get funds for it, because people are all for that, right? But it has to be part of a larger thought. It just can't be like, I want to pave a little path right here, right? It's got to be a bigger thought, and then you're going to have much more success in the long run.
Okay, thank you.
And may I also just add, so at a working level, when we put together a work plan, one of the goals of this committee was to put together those priorities and work with the cities to identify what the priorities are. So I just want to highlight that in the March meeting, that is our plan, to talk through the priorities that have been raised to me as part of the committee liaison in a presentation that goes through by corridor, Sprinter and Coaster, what the priorities of each of those cities have been as identified by those communities.
So one final question to kind of bear down on Councilmember Jenkins' question. What will be the decision point for the NCTD board once our work as a committee is done?
I think the decision point for NCTD's board is not until the cities, the individual cities make a decision point. So, because primarily we already have a board policy that supports the implementation of these types of agreements, and projects and agreements. And so typically this only comes to the board at the point of a project is ready to go. We have an MOU and the board where board authorization is required for such MOU.
So just to follow up on that, you know, while you all were chatting, I was thinking, of course, each of our cities know, you know, what some of the prioritized projects are. And then this committee, it sounds like we'll be discussing those next month. Is there an opportunity for you all to share that back with each of our cities so that we have the ability to then maybe have that either you all, and I'm looking to you because I'm trying to figure out, like, in terms of resources, what makes the most sense to share back with the cities, like whether it's a presentation or it's a report out and saying, hey, if you all are going to take action, here are some of the recommendations from the board.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we had a discussion, I think, at our strategic planning meeting about improving that communication. And I think we just need to figure out on a city by city basis, you know, a city may want us to come to a city council meeting and make a presentation, or a city may want us to formally communicate, this is, you know, this is the list. Whatever you need to guide us from a staff perspective on how to best engage with your city.
So just a couple of thoughts, and this is just more food for thought. You know, we have our, we do a transportation update, for instance, and that might be a really great way to engage with NCTD, just to say, hey, these are some other thoughts and ideas. Our transportation department comes and talks to us about what they've been working on every 6 months, just to give us an update. And then the other piece is, obviously, many of us will be looking at our budgeting in the next few months. So, you know, just trying to figure out, okay, well, whether it's this cycle or next cycle, the conversation needs to start at some point. So I know, obviously, I think they start to draft it in the next month. So I don't even know if it would be feasible this year, but I just wanted to throw that out there, that if we're thinking about wanting to get this in front of folks, then we need to do it prior to, you know, that
again,
timeframe.
we're on your clock. So when but I would just say, no matter what, if you have a priority, then no one says you need to have 100 million or 200 or whatever. But you should set aside a nominal investment of a few $100,000, depending on the scale and scope of your project. And we can help you, if you tell us, like, this is what we're thinking about, we could tell you, okay, a rough order of magnitude number from a budgeting point of view that will allow you to participate in studies and get the detailed information is something that you do want to do. And that's always, like, one of the challenges that even here at the district, between the investment for planning for a project, and at the same time, you got projects that that you're ready to actually implement. And what I found is that for significant, important, and critical projects, every day that we delay on getting a planning study done related to that project, or advancing a level of engineering to give us more refined project plans and cost estimates, is a day lost, because you can't compete for money if you don't have a plan. And so I would just say, as you think through how you want us to engage with you, understand every day of inaction means you probably pushed your program back further and further from being able to compete for a grant. If you have a document, whether it be a 15% planning document or a 30% document, you can submit that as a basis for a grant, but you cannot submit a happy picture and say, give me money. You know what I mean? So you gotta show people you're committed to advancing the project, and then you can seek whether you're going to fund a phase or next study of a phase or moving directly to construction.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think one of the things that would be fruitful, at least I'll speak for my council, is really helpful to have this type of dialogue, right? Like to be able to ask you all those types of questions, because I think obviously there are some of us that might have that visibility and understanding, but others that may need a little bit more support in terms of what information they need to have to make that decision to invest in it. So I think that would be, at least from Carlsbad's perspective, I would say it would be really helpful to have, I know we've talked about it and you mentioned it and alluded to it earlier, just that touch point of how do we engage with one another. And I think that would be really helpful, because I think in order for us to move forward on some of these things that I know have been, I think we've been waiting on for quite a few years. And I mean, this is before my time. I think definitely something that would help and that Carlsbad would benefit from is just being able to have that conversation.
Okay, final one from me, I promise. I totally echo what my colleague said about the need for knowing these costs like at this specific moment of time, because we are going to be entering our budget discussions in a week from now. And so we as a city were able to even get to this point of having this conversation because we had budgeted a small amount, $250,000, to move forward the at-grade crossing. And so I think what I'm hearing from Councilmember Bob Patel and what I would like to echo is please let us know what the next ask could be for us to include in our budgets to keep moving this forward and not miss this zeitgeist moment that we're having where we've got infrastructure money from the federal government, and keep us appraised of that. Thank you.
Awesome. Really good questions, comments from the board. I have a few myself. So I know it can be difficult because at the city level, it's like, what do we need to do to be able to marry up with NCTD, because we're going to be the lead agency. And I know, some of our cities just haven't had a long-standing working relationship with NCTD on some of these projects. So it's very new. So I do appreciate, just being able to be proactive on this side. So that way we can take that energy into our respective cities. So I want to thank NCTD and staff for meeting up with my city of Vista, because I know we want to be extremely competitive for grade separation, specifically, the whole corridor would be great, but specifically at Vista Village, so we can enhance safety. And one of my questions has to do with looking at the slide 4 where it says funding requirements, limits to discretionary funding within a geographic area. Is it when we go to compete for this funding and we have some cities along the low sand corridor, and then we have our cities along the Sprinter corridor, are we able to tie those two into the same type of geographic plan, or are those two going to be competing against each other since they are different?
Well, I will tell you, so we really do try to take a programmatic approach. Now, it may be sometime a project within a programmatic approach. And I'll give you an example just to kind of help. So back during the COVID period, NCTD and BNSF did a planning study together, and it was called the BNSF NCTD pathing study. Within that pathing study, there's a whole program of projects, and we ended up getting funding in separate tranches for capital infrastructure. So the Downtown Convention Center project, the Delmar Bluff 5 and 6 stabilization project, Delmar, the San Diego project phase 1, a couple other projects were all included in that bundle. We came back for signal modernization within that same program of projects. All this does is it allows us to keep the federal folks understanding that, hey, this agency has a playbook and it has all of these different projects to achieve this benefit. And so it allows us to leverage. So it doesn't have to be the case of every project going at the same time. If you were to advance, for example, a programmatic quiet zone, that would be great to be able to put that as one project, multi-jurisdictional, one lead agency, because that makes it easier for the federal funding partners to know who the heck they're talking to and a level of confidence about the projects being delivered. So again, none of these things are challenges as long as you have a program and plan that has been rationalized, been vetted among all of the stakeholders. So like if you try to do a project and you haven't talked to NCTD, or if we haven't talked to BNSF, or if we haven't talked to Amtrak, or if we haven't talked to your local government, those projects end up with public controversy, and likely not funded if they're hearing different things between those partners plus Sandag and other folks. So it's all about developing a solid program and executing based upon that program.
Yeah, and I would add, it all depends on the funding mechanism too. Whether it's a grant or whatever it may be, what is the eligibility requirements? That's important to look at. It's certainly, yes, it can be done. For one thing, always have a plan. Two, multiple states have come together for the same grant money. So that's much more difficult, trying to get two states to agree. And many times it does require a lead agency to take the lead. So you have to kind of work those negotiations out. But I can tell you, if states can do it, and it's not pretty, but it can be done. But the bigger issue is having a plan, as we talked about before, because that shows that you're organized. There may be some things you have to iron out. It's not always going to be a fun process, but the end product is what you want, and that's to get the improvements.
Okay, yeah, and I'm just trying to figure out how we can best manage this, because we have various different grants, we have various jurisdictions and agencies that have to work together, and so this then brings another question to my mind, which is, if we as cities are going to be lead agencies, at what point is that too many people trying to be a lead agency for a regional project? So how does that work? Like if for example, right, I'm just going to use the Sprinter corridor. If Vista and San Marcos are really like, we are gung-ho, we're going forward, we want these great separations. The county's in there too because of the Buena Creek station. So if these three different jurisdictions are each taking the lead in their respective area, then how do we herd all those cats?
Well, so my answer on that would be is that we would be doing those concurrently, and likely NCTD would be the primary submitter of those grants, or either Sandag would be. So we, especially on those kind of programmatic types of projects, we're going to be in the best position in terms of getting the grant and tying it to whether it be goods movement, people movement, or other transportation needs. So that's just where where we would be collaborating, and we would be taking the lead on that. And even in those types of opportunities, Caltrans becomes an excellent partner for us. And I know, within this framework of how we're looking to do the Sprinter improvements, significant portion of that is tied into hopefully the multimodal study along the 78, where we believe we can probably get a significant project lift of funding through the Caltrans project, because they're going to need to have multimodal improvements. So all of this is just collaboration. And in fact, I would just tell you guys, I would not really worry about those kinds of administrative, about who's going to be the lead, that kind. It's really about, do we have local buy-in to do something? And do we have a good plan? If you have local buy-in and consistency among the elected officials to say, we want to do this thing, we have a commitment, we know we're not going to get a project for free. So we have to have a realistic expectation of, we're going to all have to figure out how to fund this project. And then we got to have a plan. Everything else goes. You'd be shocked at, when the approach that we take sometimes here with pursuing discretionary dollars, where folks will look at me when I'll say we're going to go for it and we don't have the local match right now. And we did that, but I knew we were going to get the local match after we got the federal dollars. And it happens every single time because we always have excellent plans that meet the requirements of the grant. We always try to get that partnership between all of the key stakeholders, and then you're off and running. So that is not the thing to really worry about. Is the Vista City Council, or is the Carlsbad City Council, is Encinitas, are you all in agreement to do this thing Are you willing to commit funding towards making this a success? And do we have a plan that everybody has agreed to as the go forward strategy? That's what's important. Everything else we can get through together.
Okay, so then it's almost like we're the leads, and then it goes into a more collaborative, and then NCTD could be the lead. The reason that I'm asking is that I feel like we don't have enough space, different platforms available for collaboration for the type of discussions that we need to have. So I don't know if we need to have like a workshop type of thing, because I really don't think that we've had enough time and enough space in a organized fashion that is still taking considerations of the Brown Act and stuff, all these other things that we have to take into consideration, where we've been able to say, these are the priorities for my city. How does that align with the priorities of your city? Who's going to take the lead at city council? At my council, it only takes one member to put something on the agenda, but I know that's not the same for other councils. So that's where I think we need to have a little bit more space and time and a platform to collaborate on those types of things, because I think there's a lot of energy wanting to get this done, whether it's the coastal cities for the low sand corridor or the inland cities for the Sprinter line. But we're kind of running out of time, and I don't know how we're going to do that collaboration. So is this something that we could have a workshop on? That's
Oh yeah, and we could. So the basis of this committee was that.
right.
So and so the basis of this committee was that the city staff would participate, they would communicate with NCTD and begin the process, because the key piece is it's not nearly that complicated, because once we know that a city has prioritized project that's consistent with something that we're trying to do, it will go into our discretionary program, and then we can collaborate. We can create agreements about how we collaborate. The truth or answer is if your city has a priority, you could call me and say, hey, Matt, we have this priority. That's not the same as your city council publicly approving that this is a priority and directing the staff to work with NCTD on a project. Until we get that, I could be talking to someone 200 years and nothing ever happens. So really the ball is in each of your city's court. I mean, Encinitas is already really partnering with NCTD at a pretty high level. We've got agreements in place. We've done stuff together. Each of your cities has to say to your staff, hey, we want to do something, and let's work towards making that happen. That's really the kickoff point for us, because I can talk to your city managers, we can have discussions, and keep in mind, all of this is fairly new. All the availability of funding to support these types of initiatives. And I think even the highlight of the importance of doing these kinds of things, as we've talked about more housing in the region, and then needing to harmonize transportation with how we live day to day and mitigate some of those impacts. It's fairly new in terms of the consciousness combined with funding being available. But the first step is for your city, because we can't make your city do anything. It's for your cities to say, these are priorities. And then once we see that those are priorities that directly relate to NCTD, I can assure you, we'll be on the move with your city as quickly as possible, trying to create a framework agreement about how we collaborate, and then moving towards more formalized agreements about how do we get the money, how do we advance this project.
So is March going to be kind of like what I'm describing, that meeting with looking at priorities from the cities that we've heard? Because so far, I don't know what the priorities are for any of the other cities except for mine.
Okay, no, so we can go through again what's in the regional plan and some of the projects that we've identified. So we've up and down the Sprinter Corridor as an example, as well as San Diego subdivision. We've identified locations where grade separation projects would be great, or where other quality of life initiative that's already exists.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll work with Lillian and Devin and the team to make those more manifestly, abundant.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful.
But the key piece is it's a lot of projects. We need to know from the cities coming in, what is your priority project?
Right.
What are your priority projects? And I think that's kind of the key, is understanding that. So it would be more helpful for March if you could come in, and if we needed to move it, could be April, could be May. I mean,
Mhm.
these grants are going to be continue to come around at least for the foreseeable future. If we could identify, if we could have the city of Vista tell us what your top priorities are.
Sure. Yeah. Because what I'm thinking is if we're going to do this as a region and I go to my council and I'm like, we're going to have a meeting and we're going to, push to make sure that we have enough funding for enough seed money for planning funding. But I want to be able to have a comprehensive document that's kind of just like baseline for all our region for me to say, okay, council members, this is our piece of the pie for Vista. This is why this project is so important because it ties in with some of the priorities that San Marcos has, that the county has, that Oceanside has, right? And we're going to be able to get our sprinter to 15-minute headways and not create a huge backup issue for our emergency services that go through this corridor, right? So just being able to have like a better discussion.
I got you.
Yeah. So I would love to be able to do that because, I'm at this point, I'm going to be like calling my city manager and being like, I want to have this on the agenda so that we can I can have a conversation within the parameters that we need to have conversations at our city council level so that we can start advancing this because some of our councils move fast and some of them move really slow. So I want to be able to have a baseline where we can all bring this to our councils and just say, this is our regional plan. And there's a lot of money out there and that money is going to go quickly, but that's why it's important for us to move this with our budget cycle or whatever the case might be. So I think it would be really helpful to have a comprehensive document, just even at a high level overview of what each one of the cities are doing. So that way we can, and then we can make these meetings even more effective and efficient for our end goal, which is getting that funding for our regional stuff that we want to do. Yes.
So thank you. I wanted to share that we are all on the same page. We have been working through robust meetings with the cities. We are meeting with them on an individual basis to identify what those priorities are. Since the beginning of this committee, we've shared all of the information that we've shared with you, the policies, the grant funding that's available, as well as identifying what's in the Sandag Regional Plan, what's in the CMCP, what is in the TIRCP, what do these terms mean, and why are the benefits of bundling projects, identifying regional benefits, regional projects, working together, why all of that is so critical. And moving forward in this month, we have meetings scheduled with Oceanside, Vista, Escondido to really hone further those priorities. We have data calls to the city. What can I provide you to share additional information? What do you need from us to help inform your decision making? So we are anticipating that we will have prioritized lists by city available for you in March.
Okay.
Amazing. Thank you, Lillian.
That's what I wanted to make sure. I'm gleaning what you're asking for us from an actual perspective is kind of a pull together of all of these projects by city into a document that has transparent ease. You all can look at them together. We could even take a stab at looking at breaking them out in groups of, what looks like what may be on a near-term forecast of something that's already happening or could happen midterm and longer range because could be tied to other project initiatives. So if I'm hearing you're looking for us to compile that by city, and then for us to prioritize this, give you a basis of how we prioritize these things, so that you can look at that and have that as kind of your walk around documents. And then to the degree that we can do that is to connect where projects could be done programmatically together or create the force multiplier effect.
And let me just add.
That'd be great.
Reiterate something that was mentioned by Mr. Bond earlier, right? And kind of along the discussion with the vice chair. We also want to pull in our federal partners and state partners as early as possible, right? Because as was mentioned, CPUC has the final decision on the location. So you may have an idea of where you want a crossing. Your engineers may have a location, but that may not be the actual location where the crossing's needed, right? And so ironing those issues out early is what we want to achieve, because that will help everybody and help streamline these projects and get them done.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think that this discussion is really important because up until now, I really, I feel like we're in silos, and this is going to be regional money that we're trying to be really competitive for. And yeah, I mean, that way we know, hey, this other city, you know, maybe I need to go speak at that city and advocate for this too, as a board member of NCTD. So I think it's going to be really beneficial to have kind of that high overview. And basically, for people to understand this, it needs to be like a picture book, right? I mean, it has to be simplified, but with enough detail. And then that way we can see programmatically how we're going to put all these things together and what kind of funding we can go after, so we can be competitive as a region. So, you know, we can continue to grow our ridership and really get to the mission of what we're trying to do. I had some other questions, but they're not super important. And it looks like Councilmember Bhat Patel has some questions.
Just a comment. It's so from a potentially question, it sounds like it will all be, we'll be aggregating all of the different priorities from all the different cities together. You'll be disseminating that to, will that be to the entire board? And then of course, this committee will be discussing. Okay.
Yes. And I think kind of what you guys are alluding to, and I'm not sure that all of this can come together nice and neatly in March, because March is when the cities are supposed to be coming in. But I do think it kind of along the lines of what you guys are saying, we do need to create the path to pull this together into something that is a toolbox for people of information that ultimately comes to the full board. And that we work through that from a full board perspective, that even if we want to adopt priorities within, you know, from a board perspective, that creates the opportunity for the board to do, so that we do need to move this conversation along. I don't know, and I'll get with staff about, you know, your next few meetings, because you guys likely are signing up for more meetings so that we
I was going to bring that up. Yeah.
It's likely going to be the need for more meetings to be able to bring this forward in a way that you are articulating, that I think also is necessary to really put this something into a package. Because the critical piece would be, is if we get board consensus and we have city council consensus from a North County point of view, this is a program of projects that we certainly can leverage from a regional, from a state, and from a federal perspective. And that's the way we need to be approaching this. Is, you know, this gives us the opportunity to advocate for specific transportation needs, not what we don't like, but, you know, what we would like to do together. And I think this was an excellent opportunity to do that.
Just a couple extra questions, or not questions, but in terms of, you know, we created a strategic plan for the city of Carlsbad, and instead of just goal setting, we did like, okay, what are we going to do in terms of a strategic plan, right? Like for the next 5 years, these are our goals. And so similarly, I'm not saying that we need to do this for something like this, but just some of the things that we had done in terms of a spreadsheet of different items, like for our traffic emergency or the bike emergency that we have in place, we had like our different projects that we could potentially have, and then level of difficulty and cost associated. So I'm assuming that would be part of that, so that we understand, okay, this is attainable in like short term, long term. I know you mentioned that, but then also what is the cost, so that we can all figure out, okay, do we want to move forward with something that's $100 million versus $50 million, and it'll take us 2 years versus 3 years or whatever else?
Yeah, and we won't be able to produce costs for everything. And a lot of times it's easier just to talk about cost to go to the next phase, you know, to begin. And remember, some of your earlier costs, you can spend $25,000, $50,000 just to get a rough order of magnitude and schedule. That's a good investment, and for a lot of projects where you have no baseline information. But absolutely, and again, that's why I'm qualifying the more detail, which is what we need to get, will require a little bit more time for us to mature this in the way that you're requesting, that I think is needed for this. Okay, and I know we're talking about, you know, a committee, then a board, and a council, you know, all of those folks have to weigh in order for this to even move forward. What is the order of operations? Like, what would make the most sense? Because if it does take extra time for that to be generated,
does this need to first, the discussion in terms of priorities need to happen at the council level? And if so, then should we all be discussing that? Then it comes back to this committee, then it goes to the full board. I'm just trying to get that order of
I would say
operations.
we have to take all of this on concurrently. So like to me, if you know you have priorities within your cities, you need to be vetting that out and working through kind of the baseline of what authority does your, chief administrative officer or city manager need, not to spend 100 million, but to go work on a project with the support of council, knowing that he was authorized or she was authorized to work on that project. At the same time, we're over here already working. So we're going to continue doing our work, and we're going to continue then to plug, and we can go to our board and your council at the same time and continue to mature the discussions. But literally, I can't overstate this. The most critical thing is, you're not going to probably try to 50 projects as your priority. You're going to have 1 to 2 to 3 projects. The most helpful thing is getting clarity at your city that these 3 are our top priority projects. And so for each of you who are here today, that's what your top work is, to go to your city, to get that priority agreed upon at a city council level, not a commitment of a ton of money, just a commitment that these are priority projects. And then we can take it from there. Whether or not you have the money is not the question. The question is if it is a priority, if you're willing to authorize staff time to work on it, if you're willing to make a nominal contribution towards actually flushing out this project.
And there are four cities here, and of course the others are missing. So how do we ensure that they get that information communicated so that they can also do the
We
same?
already are communicating with those cities. But again, as we bring this to the full board, we'll get everybody on the same page at the same time in the level of depth. But we're already talking to cities across the board. We're talking to cities about projects and plans that we have and things that we would like to pursue. So that's already occurring.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but that's at a staff level. What I'm trying to say is some folks. I know Karina is above and beyond many of us, but what I meant is there are others definitely I could say on this board that may not necessarily have that visibility in terms of what the priorities are, again, similar to what I said earlier. So how do we ensure that those folks are also engaging? I mean, obviously it's up to them, but at the same time, like what can we do to ensure that at least from the board's perspective, we've provided them that opportunity?
You know what? Let me take a look at the agendas and get with the chair, because I think we probably should plan a presentation at the board sooner rather than later. Which will further create that opportunity for them, for you all to kind of share, report out, staff to make a presentation, and then we can start that engagement and introduction process. And then from that introduction process, we'll dig down deep with all of our new board members and to make sure that, we're pulling out that, hey, these are the things that are parties to NCTD. We've been discussing it with your city staff and trying to solicit their feedback and support towards moving it forward. So I would anticipate maybe over potentially February, but maybe March, April, we can come back to the board and have that discussion.
Yeah, that would be great. I think just, whether it's from the chair or yourself, just notification to folks to even start thinking about that, because we're here and we get it, but those that are not here, they may not necessarily know where to start or where to begin. And I think it's just even though it's already happening at the staff level. So yeah.
For sure for February, because we won't have a robust, but we will set aside some time on the agenda just to provide an update and some key milestone activities. And that would allow you all also opportunities to weigh in and provide feedback to the committee. So we'll do that for the February meeting, which is next week.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes. And I think we're really moving in the right direction in order for us to really have a collaborative method of working, right? Trying to get this methodology down is very difficult. We have different cities with different temperaments where staff, and council may not always see on the same page, but somehow we need to be able to do that in order to bring this to fruition. So I really appreciate that. Do we have a RSCE committee meeting in April?
Yes. Staff is nodding their head.
Okay.
It's on the work plan, but the schedule has not been set.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Cause I mean, if we're going to have in March a meeting on priorities, then, I don't know if the April one needs to be kind of like more collaborative, where we just take a look at those priorities and we talk amongst each other and to just have like a workshop style. I'm not sure, but I'm just throwing that out there that might be beneficial if we need to amend the way that we do our meeting for that particular one, for us to really have a deep dive and understand how to move this forward within our respective cities. So that way we can be on the same page and we can do it as a region. So many different levels going on, but just some food for thought. Thank you. Thank you to the board for all your questions, comments, concerns. And I think we really, with having an informational item only with no vote required, I think that we were able to provide a lot of good direction, and I appreciate all of your interest in getting this done quickly.
Chair Contreras?
Yes.
May I? Due to time constraints, our presenter for item 3 wishes to go next. So with your
Item
permission,
3.
would that be okay to take the agenda item?
Yes, we can go ahead and take that out of order.
Thank you.
So what was our last item on the agenda will now be our second item, and it will be an update on NCTD's Quiet Zone Roadmap Study. Zachary Taylor, NCTD Signal Manager, will present an update to NCTD initiatives that support and improve rail services and community interactions along the Coaster and Sprinter rail lines. It's all yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for accommodating my time constraints, and apologies for that. First, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So again, this is an update on the Quiet Zone Roadmap Study, which hopefully will help with a lot of the items that were being discussed in the previous item. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this Quiet Zone study is something that we've discussed before, but just a refresher, the objective here is to provide the stakeholders, being the cities, a document that can help them with a lot of the questions that you guys have been discussing earlier. Most importantly, typical costs, durations, who the stakeholders are, who the regulators are, that sort of thing, as kind of a piece of reference material that each of these cities can go to and do hopefully a lot of the work themselves to answer some of the questions that they're currently not sure or asking where to go. So obviously NCTD receives a lot of these questions, and I think Mr. Tucker's intent with this was to give as many resources as we could possibly provide to the stakeholders to be able to do as much of the work for as little of the cost as they could on their own. So where are we? We've executed a task order agreement with Pacific Railway Enterprises, that's PRE, our engineer of record on the signal side, to create this roadmap, and we'll give an update on where we are right now. If we can go to the next slide. So first, a little bit of background on some of the things. So we've talked about the train horn rule earlier. The train horn rule is essentially why our trains blow at the crossings, right? So I won't go through it here, but it is a federal regulation, and essentially what it says is even if we do establish quiet zones, there may still be the need for an operator to blow the horns at a crossing if there's a safety issue, if they see a trespass or something like that. So while quiet zones, sound really great as far as let's not have any noise at all, we always want to make sure that people are aware that it's up to operator discretion and safety related items to make sure that that is still available, but still obviously want to keep this as quiet as possible. So go to the next slide, please. Okay, this was touched a little bit earlier as well. Two terms, supplemental safety measures and alternative safety measures. And Devin will correct me if I get this wrong, but supplemental safety measures are essentially safety measures that have been evaluated systemically or on a holistic level by the FRA and deemed that they do, if implemented at a rail grade crossing, improve the safety of that particular crossing, right? So these could be exit gates, these could be pedestrian gates, these could be channelization. But essentially it's standard protocol type improvements that are proven to improve safety. Now, an alternative safety measure is something that falls outside of those cookie cutter type fixtures. So if we wanted to do something that's that's not going to fit within there, then that's called an alternative safety measure. And essentially what it means is somebody has to evaluate how safe, is it, how much improvement is it going to make to the safety case. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so how much risk is actually something that the FRA helps us figure out. We have they have a website that I think we'll cover in the next slide, but right now, with no quiet zone implemented, you can take a grouping of crossings. There's a calculator that we'll talk about and look at, and you can put all the information in there for that particular corridor, for those particular crossings, and it's going to identify for you what the crossing corridor risk index is. So that's, essentially a numerical value, assigned to what the risk currently is for a grouping set of crossings. Now, what you'll do with that calculator is you'll be able to put in suggested improvements, SSMs, and what you would need, obviously, is to represent an improvement to the safety for your particular, selection of crossings, and then based on the improvements that you would make, that's what is going to represent your quiet zone risk index. So the quiet zone risk index is essentially the evaluation of the safety of those crossings after you've implemented, whatever safety measures, additional safety measures, supplemental safety measures have been selected. So obviously what you want to see in that case for approval from these various agencies is that your crossing corridor risk index is at one level, and then once you implement your quiet zone risk index, that level has gone down. So obviously we're only going to get a quiet zone established if we're reducing risk on a large level, right? If we can get on the next slide, please. Okay, so what are affected by this? So number of predicted collisions per year, that's based on historical data. The severity of those accidents, amount of traffic, both vehicular and train, and obviously the density of crossings. All these things are going to impact these risk indexes. We get on the next slide, please. All right, so where is NCTD right now in our creation of this document? So we kicked off the project in end of October of 2022 with PRE. During that next 2 to 3 month period, PRE worked on their first draft of the document based on the scope of work, and that was received by NCTD at the beginning of January. We reviewed that document and provided comments, and as well as had a comment review and resolution meeting on January 17th. And PRE is now taking those comments into account and continuing work on that document. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so what do we have in the document right now? So this is the table of contents. Obviously, there's a lot of information. It's like a 45-page document at the moment. It's going to get larger. So just wanted to kind of give you guys the overview of what's in it. Right now, the intent is that it kind of reads like like a handbook. So we're giving a lot of the background, a lot of the information, and then the intent is to have kind of the body be very readable, and then we'll go to indexes for more of the in-depth information. So when it comes to schedules, estimated costs, contacts, all of that is kind of separated out so that you can reference that information very easily. But if you just want kind of an overview from kind of start to finish on what does this process look like, who are the players involved, all that sort of thing, it's kind of written in a narrative form. So let's talk about a little bit more in depth what is in each of these sections on the next slide. All right, so in more detail, we talked about this, the background of the regulators, the laws that influence all of this stuff, explanation of the safety measures needed to establish a quiet zone. Okay, so the explanation of how to use the FRA provided quiet zone calculator. So I mentioned that earlier. This is actually a website that anybody from any of the cities can go onto. You can log into, and we're going to provide an explanation of exactly how to use this calculator so that you can select your crossings that you intend to make improvements at. You can select the improvements you intend to make by using this document that we're going to provide, with cost estimates and that sort of thing. And you can see how that's going to affect the risk index for that crossing and potentially multiple crossings. Explain the process for establishing a quiet zone, typical expected schedules for activities. Now, obviously, we're going to try and provide best estimates, but as we heard from Devin, with regulators and third parties, sometimes that's a little bit out of our control, but obviously more information is better than less. So we're going to do what we can to provide that. Cost estimates, I'll touch that on the next slide. And then as well as we want to make sure that there's information about all the different agencies and roles and responsibilities that are expected in a typical project like this, so that people know who's involved, typically in what form or fashion they're going to be speaking on different items from one of these projects. And then lastly, we're going to include an accounting of all the grade crossings that NCTD has, as well as the safety pictures that are in place, so that you can tell exactly where you're starting from and what potential improvements there might be available. We go to the next slide. All right, so what is still under development and what is going to be improved upon? So the quiet zone calculator explanation is going to be expanded upon. The intent is to provide estimates that are kind of in an a la carte fashion. So because we can't anticipate and guess, what the best solution for each crossing is, and the intent is not to do a preliminary engineering study for all of our crossings. What we wanted to do is be able to give the cities the ability to pick and choose, for various safety improvements. What's the cost of adding channelization fence versus a pedestrian crossing versus extending a median, that sort of thing, so that you guys can get ideas of how those all add up and change the overall price tag, right? We're going to improve the clarifications about roadway versus pedestrian, as Devin mentioned. One's on a state level and one's on a federal level, so the report needs a little bit more detail on that. And it's still at a preliminary level, so there's a lot of just details and added information yet to come. So that's where we're standing, and that's where it's moving towards development. I think I have one or two more slides. We go to the next one. Oh, I guess that was it. So any questions? I feel like I missed one slide there, but the intent for this is
I think you missed the next steps slide.
Yeah, I
Looks
feel
like
like I had
we
one.
have it, but it looks like it disappeared on this other one. Oh, there it is. Bam.
Okay, I thought I had one more thing there. All right, so a revised study will be submitted to NCTD in fiscal year quarter 4 of this year. So that's summer of 2023. We'll be reviewing that draft, final, giving comments, getting it back, and then a presentation to the NCTD board in quarter 1 of fiscal year 2024, which is again still summer of 2023. So that's when we can expect that this will be presented to the stakeholders and to the board, and for use from everyone. So that is that's it. Be happy to answer any questions that there might be.
Thank you so much. And Suhail, do we have any public comments on this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
All right, so at this time, we are ending the public registration to speak on this item. Are there any questions from the board? Yes.
Thank you. That was a really comprehensive presentation. I still struggle with the differences between the supplemental safety measures and the alternative, I can't even remember the rest of the words, but would you contextualize that for us? Maybe even in the case of Encinitas crossings and how this effort will help us determine what we need and where?
I will admit that I'm not yet an expert on this. I will give my understanding, and if Devin's still around, he might be able to correct me. My understanding is that supplemental safety measures are essentially safety measures that are well established as providing a benefit. So at a typical quiet zone crossing, you could often expect to see exit gates. and exit gates are more or less implemented in fairly the same way. So that would have some value associated with it. Now, at a pedestrian crossing, there may be multiple different ways of handling, channelization, even, a gate arm versus no gate arm on your flasher, that sort of thing. So it's not as well a cookie cutter, just implement this thing and you get this value of benefit. And I think that's where it comes in as a ASM, alternative safety measure. So supplemental safety measure would be well-established cookie cutter type implementations, and a alternative safety measure would be maybe something that's a little bit less proven, but could still be very effective.
I made the mistake of not leaving when I had the chance. No, that was, it's a good description. To give you a background behind the intent, the supplemental was really meant to try to cut down on all the review and engagement the FRA would have to do if every community wanted a quiet zone. Because when the rule was passed, it was known that there was going to be that desire, and it would just been impossible to, especially in the early days of that rule when it came out, it would be impossible to get every community and have the time and effort needed to go and do an analysis at every location. So as it was described, those are supplemental measures. We call them supplemental to whatever your existing whatever you have existing there. And they have a known effect, right? We know that they work and they will reduce people going around the gates effectively. So it was really intended just to cut down on the amount of, I'm hearing myself, that's great. The amount of work the FRA would have to do in reviews. And the interesting here, though, if you're looking at pedestrian crossings, again, those are really tied towards traffic. So if you're doing pedestrian, as we kind of talked about before, since that kind of falls in this weird limbo land of approvals for quiet zones, you're likely looking at some level of field investigation and approval. So if it's traffic and traffic only, typically the supplemental measures can be a good way to make the improvements and self-govern, if you will. But when we talk about pedestrians, you're probably going to have to be engaging with FRA and get some sort of field diagnostics performed and look at, can you just use supplemental, or are you going to need something else?
Got it. So in the case of Encinitas, for example, we might be able to use the supplemental safety measures for all of our existing crossings. But as we refine for the at-grade crossings that we don't have, we'd probably be looking at the AWS.
Well, the caveat I'd put in there, right, is if again, you're just doing traffic, that's one thing. But if you're going to be mixing pedestrian crossings in there with it, you're probably looking at the entire quarter.
Okay, so every existing crossing might need a combination of both SSM and AWS
Yes.
for our existing ones. Okay.
Because once you move into that realm, they're going to look at it from the effectiveness of the quarter, not just that one individual crossing or the next individual crossing. They're going to look at the entire endpoint to endpoint.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you for the assist, Devin.
Excuse me, I have a question. How does this study fit in with our previous discussion when this isn't going to be done until and come to the board until 2024?
Well, it fits really nicely. So this is the foundational information that you need. And again, I mean, I don't share the opinion that we're going to shotgun everything into 23 and get all of this funding.
Okay.
This is pulling this together all of the communities and creating a programmatic approach. Should people sign up, this will give us enough time to be able to execute all of the partnership agreements and other things that we need to do to put us in a good position. It will also allow us to take a good look at if we can add these on to our ongoing signal modernization program, including that program delivery with that on the San Diego subdivision is slated to wrap up in sometime in 2024. And so we already are advancing a project for signal improvements on the Escondido subdivision. And right now BNSF is delivering all of the projects on the San Diego subdivision. So I just spoke with them yesterday about, working towards to see if we can add the Escondido subdivision, but then we also look at what other projects that we can add, because that's going to be the most efficient and effective method. So what we're creating right now is foundational. Foundational towards enhancing the project delivery. This will likely enable us, if we can go the programmatic route, to kind of be in more of a design build world for project implementation versus design bid build one by one.
Okay. So it's not like this has to be done before.
No. Remember what I said, if we
It's all
got,
happening together.
if we got collaboration and we got a plan, we're gonna win.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There is no vote required for this item. It's informational only. Seeing as how we only have 10 minutes until our allotted time is over, would you all want to defer this last item, which is the second presentation, to the next meeting? Or did you want to go through it?
I think we could probably do it in 10 minutes.
All right, let's do it in 10 minutes and 9 minutes if we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Good afternoon, commission members, NCTD staff, and members of the public. I'm here to provide some information about our recently completed El Portal undercrossing in the city of Encinitas. Next slide, please. And could you clarify? Oh, sorry. I'm Jill Bankston with the city of Encinitas. I'm the director of engineering and city engineer.
I'm sorry, I didn't even do that part. Skip that.
So this is an overview of the project area here. We have the NCTD corridor that splits our community in half. On the west side, we've got Coast Highway with all the residents and businesses and shops and beaches. On the east side, we have Vulcan Avenue with an elementary school, farmers market, and other residences. There's 2 legal crossings in this particular stretch of the corridor. At the south end, we've got Encinitas Boulevard, and we have Leucadia Boulevard at the north end. Next slide, please. So this is what the area looked like before we put in our crossing. It's pretty flat and unobstructed. We've got lots of urban development, lots of peds, lots of cyclists, and lots of pedestrians walking across the tracks. Click one more. And that's what that looks like. So it's pervasive, but diffuse. So we've got lots of people crossing the tracks all over the corridor. Next slide, please. So this was what we undertook to get our crossing approved. So specific to the El Portal undercrossing, we had several instances of public engagement and public meetings. We had our initial community meetings between 2005 and 2008, where we were looking at different locations for this undercrossing and looking at various conceptual designs and getting public input. Between 2013 and 2015, we had our Safe Routes to School pedestrian plan because we have Paul Ecke Elementary School right across from where our new crossing is. And again, prioritization of what the undercrossing will look like and various elements in there. 2017 to 2020, we had more public engagement, 3 meetings talking about aesthetics and giving project updates on this schedule and how the design was coming along. And between 2022, which is when the undercrossing was completed, and 2023, we're doing some education and outreach, particularly with the school children, but with the rest of the cycling and walking community at large, to encourage them to use the undercrossing and use that safe crossing location. Next slide. So this is a rundown of the agency coordination required for an undercrossing. So the city of Encinitas, our part was the design and the community engagement and getting the coastal development permit and the various other permits. We partnered with NCTD and they looked at our designs and compared them with the LoSAN standards. We executed an MOU with NCTD for the city to operate the undercrossing in the right of way, and we got a right of entry permit from NCTD. For CPUC, we had the site diagnostic meeting and we were responsive to their comments. And then we had the formal application and approval. And then with SANDAG, they did a check for future improvements. This is where the coastal rail trail will eventually be going through. There's future double tracking in this area as well. So we wanted to make sure that our undercrossing was going to be able to be consistent with those future projects. So we got also from SANDAG a letter of consistency with the regional transportation plan. And then ultimately we executed an MOU and a project management plan for SANDAG to administer the construction phase of this project for us. Next slide. I won't go through the detail of this one since we're low on time, but this is a way for you to kind of look back through all the different touch points with the various agencies as we collaborated and coordinated in getting this project approved. Next slide. There was lots of talk about funding. So this was our timeline for getting this project approved. So it started way back in 1999 when our city council approved 3 grade separated pedestrian crossings. In 2003, we initiated a study with Sandag to get some more detail on what those crossings might look like. In 2009, there was a grade separation study for the 3 pedestrian crossings. In 2013, we completed our first undercrossing. That's the Swamis or Santa Fe undercrossing. That one was about $6 million, and that was jointly funded with Sandag and NCTD and the city of Encinitas. In 2015, we were successful in getting an ATP grant, an active transportation program grant, for a portion of the El Portal construction costs. 2017, we awarded a design contract for our El Portal undercrossing. And then in 2019, we executed MOUs with NCTD and Sandag for construction and maintenance. And 2020 was that project management plan with NCTD and Sandag for Sandag to administer construction. We began construction in January 2021 and wrapped up in the summer around June, July 2022. And then we've got a future Verde crossing. So that's the 3rd crossing of the 3 crossings that were initially approved in 1999. We have design complete on that project, and we recently submitted a FRA Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant application for that project. Next slide. So the total cost of our El Portal undercrossing, about $12.5 million. The bulk of that obviously is construction, and then construction support through Sandag. You see the design, CEQA permitting, and then our education and outreach costs broken down on this pie chart as well. Next slide. So this is what the corridor looked like before. Upper left-hand side, you can see the rail corridor splitting the Vulcan on the right side of the picture at 101 on the left side of the picture. And we implemented this rail undercrossing project along with our Leucadia streetscape project that added the roundabouts and the green bike lanes and was a lane diet and pedestrian paths, landscaping, things like that. So it really transformed the area. Next slide, please. So again, this is what it looked like before, nice and easy to walk right over those tracks. You're looking at the school from the 101 here, and obviously you see the train coming. Next slide. So we had 3 all work windows that we used in order to construct this. What that means is that's times when the rail is not on the line. So they have 2.5 day shutdowns where there's no rail traffic. You can take out the lines and get the construction going. Next slide, please. So here we have the piles drilled in. They're setting the abutments on top of the piles. Next slide. Here we are forming and pouring the columns. Next slide. Here we're forming the retaining walls for the ramps and the stairs down to the undercrossing. Next slide. Here the retaining walls are in place and we're working on the flat work, the sidewalks, the stairs, things like that. Next slide. And here's what it looks like at the end. It's a really amazing project that's really transformed the community. It's improved safety, mobility, access, walkability. It's just a fantastic asset to the community. Next slide. So now we see lots of people riding their bikes under it, walking their kids to school, walking their dogs, going to get coffee. Next slide. And of course, getting to the beach. Next slide. And that's the result of this wonderful project. If you have any questions, please let me know.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. And this is just an incredible project. And it really is a model for, I think, what a lot of us want to do along these corridors. Maybe not the time scale that it took, but it's just fantastic. And Sukhil, do we have any public comments for this agenda item?
No, Madam Chair.
All right. So at this time, we are ending public registration to speak on this item. Are there any questions from the board or comments?
I guess I would just comment that this is kind of an answer to the question I asked earlier about how long it takes. You really started in 2005, initialing, well, 1999, you started. I guess, were you there the whole time? Okay.
I was not.
What do you think was the biggest hurdle or longest issue to overcome?
Sure.
There were probably many, but I'm just curious because I think, okay.
Funding was. The city of Encinitas has taken the lead on a couple of projects, significant projects, and it's money. And for the city of Encinitas is not the biggest city, in the world. These are big, heavy lift projects to get up and funding. Really, I wouldn't draw a comparison between anybody's. Each project stands into itself in terms of the availability of funding. Obviously, engineering time has to be assumed. It's really the availability of all the funding. This should also tell you when we talk about a project like a tunnel, that it is highly unlikely to impossible that you could build a tunnel project in 10 years.
Right. So my next question is just to give us a scope on this. How much approximately did City of Encinitas contribute to this project, would you say?
I believe it's around 9 million.
Okay, so out of the, where did I see that number? About 16 million?
13, I believe, is the number. Let me find my little pie chart.
So it's a significant
Yes.
cost to a city. Okay.
Yes.
12.5.
Yeah.
Okay, and Encinitas contributed 9. Approximately. Okay.
Approximately.
Okay, thanks.
I'll just add that, so I was in 9th grade when this project was initiated, and I did go to the elementary school, and my mom and I crossed illegally every day. And it was never easy, and it was never fun, and it was always scary. And so I had a child last year, and I will have to say that this was a close second in the excitement that I experienced once it was complete. And to answer your question about the funding, when the city did receive that ATP grant, which I think was like $5 million or just under it, at that time, I think we anticipated that would cover the construction costs. And I think if we'd been ready to go with the planning and with our ducks in a line, we could have probably covered it with that money. But because councils have different priorities, there were so many other projects that were in line, it took us a really long time to finally press go and spend the money, and construction is always more expensive.
Which
when
is
you wait.
why what you're trying to do here will prohibit something starting right now in 2023 and finishing, I can't even, 18 years later. No, 1999. That would have been 23 years later. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, well, we're going to try to shrink the timetables, and hopefully with the more funding and the collaboration and what we've discussed today, we'll be able to do that. Maybe shave a few of those years off. So there is no vote required for this item. It is informational only. Thank you so much for presenting. And I just want to say it's a pleasure to see people utilizing this site. I was there for the ribbon cutting every once in a while when I'm in Encinitas. I was just eating there over the weekend, and I just I'm like, this is exactly what we need all over the place. So our next scheduled meeting is our regular board meeting on February 16th, 2023 at 2 p.m. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.